Amy's name is Sarah, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It's a story about trust, family secrets, and a nurse's whispered warning that changed everything. I never thought I'd be sharing something so personal, but if my experience can help even one person avoid the nightmare I almost walked into, then it's worth the discomfort of reliving it all. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor cast harsh shadows as I hurried down the hallway, my heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor. My father had been in the intensive care unit for 3 days following what the doctors called a massive stroke, and I was exhausted from the constant back and forth between the hospital, my job, and trying to keep my 2 teenage sons, Jake and Marcus, grounded during this chaos. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 17 and 15, they were old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but young enough to need their mother's constant reassurance that everything would somehow work out. I had been married to my husband David for 12 years, and together we had built what I thought was a solid foundation for our family. David worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, a job that required frequent travel but provided us with a comfortable middle-class lifestyle in suburban Phoenix. We lived in a modest 4-bedroom house, with a small pool in the backyard, the kind of place where neighborhood kids felt comfortable dropping by unannounced, and where barbecues happened spontaneously on weekends. My relationship with my father, Robert Mitchell, had always been complicated. After my mother died of cancer when I was 22, he had retreated into himself, becoming increasingly bitter and controlling. My younger brother Michael, who was 3 years my junior, had always been Dad's golden child. Michael was a successful corporate lawyer in Seattle, unmarried by choice, and seemed to have inherited Dad's sharp tongue and critical nature. Despite our differences, I had been the one to move Dad closer to us when his health started declining 2 years ago, convincing him to sell his house in Oregon and relocate to an assisted living facility just 15 minutes from our home. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Michael earned 3 times my salary as a high school guidance counselor, I was the one who visited Dad twice a week, took him to his doctor appointments, and fielded the calls from his care facility when he had what they diplomatically called behavioral episodes. Michael visited maybe twice a year, always with expensive gifts and grand gestures, but never with the consistency that actual caregiving required. Standing outside the ICU that Wednesday afternoon, I felt the weight of responsibility that had become familiar over the past 2 years. David was in Denver for a week-long conference, and wouldn't be back until Friday. My sons were staying with their best friend's family, understanding without being told that this wasn't the time for their usual after-school activities and teenage drama. Everything felt suspended, waiting for some kind of resolution that seemed both inevitable and impossible to accept. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Dad's neurologist, had been frank about his condition from the beginning. The stroke had been severe, affecting multiple areas of his brain. While he had regained consciousness after the first day, his speech was severely impaired, and his cognitive function appeared significantly compromised. More troubling was the fact that his right side remained almost completely paralyzed, despite the intensive physical therapy that had begun immediately. I had spent countless hours researching stroke recovery, reading medical journals online, and consulting with specialists about potential treatments and rehabilitation options. The statistics were sobering. At 78, with his medical history that included diabetes and high blood pressure, Dad's prognosis for meaningful recovery was poor. But I wasn't ready to give up, not when there were still treatment options to explore, specialized rehabilitation facilities to consider, and adaptive technologies that might help him regain some independence. Michael had flown in from Seattle the day after Dad's stroke, and I had initially felt relieved to have family support during such a difficult time. We had sat together in the waiting room during Dad's surgery to relieve pressure on his brain, and for a brief moment, it felt like we were united in our concern for our father. Michael had even commented on how well I had been handling Dad's care over the past 2 years, acknowledging the sacrifice it had required. But as the days passed, and it became clear that Dad's recovery would be a long, uncertain process, I noticed a change in Michael's demeanor. He had always been impatient with what he perceived as inefficiency, and the slow pace of hospital bureaucracy clearly frustrated him. He began making comments about the quality of care Dad was receiving, questioning every decision made by the medical team, and expressing doubts about the hospital's ability to provide adequate treatment. By the third day, Michael had started talking about realistic expectations and quality of life considerations. He had private conversations with doctors that he didn't include me in, claiming he was trying to get a clearer picture of Dad's prognosis. When I questioned him about these discussions, he assured me he was simply gathering information, but something in his tone made me uncomfortable. The tension between us came to a head on Thursday morning, when Michael suggested we needed to have a serious conversation about Dad's future care. We met in the hospital cafeteria, a sterile space filled with the quiet conversations of other families facing their own medical crises. Michael had brought his laptop and a folder of documents, approaching the conversation with the same methodical precision he brought to his legal work. He began by outlining the costs associated with Dad's ongoing care, projecting expenses for extended rehabilitation, potential home modifications, and round-the-clock nursing assistance. The numbers were staggering, easily reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next few years. Michael pointed out that Dad's insurance would cover only a fraction of these costs, and his savings, while substantial, wouldn't last more than a year or two with such intensive care requirements. Then Michael presented what he called a more practical alternative. He had researched hospice care options, focusing on comfort rather than aggressive treatment. He talked about dignity and peaceful endings, about not prolonging suffering unnecessarily. His arguments were logical, well-researched, and delivered with the kind of persuasive skill that had made him successful in his legal career. But something felt wrong about the entire conversation. Michael seemed too prepared, too eager to move toward what he presented as the inevitable conclusion. When I asked about alternative rehabilitation facilities, or experimental treatments, he dismissed them as false hope that would only drain Dad's resources and delay the inevitable. He had already contacted a hospice organization and scheduled a consultation for the following day. I found myself arguing for options that even I wasn't entirely convinced were realistic. Dad's quality of life had been declining even before the stroke, and I had watched him struggle with depression and increasing physical limitations. But the finality of Michael's approach felt premature, like we were giving up on Dad before we had truly explored every possibility. The conversation ended with Michael suggesting that I was being emotional rather than rational, that my proximity to the day-to-day caregiving was clouding my judgment. He positioned himself as the objective voice of reason, the one capable of making difficult decisions without being swayed by sentiment. It was a familiar dynamic from our childhood, where Michael's academic achievements and our father's favoritism had given him an air of authority that I had rarely challenged. That evening, I sat alone in Dad's room, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the constant beeping of monitors. He had been sleeping most of the day, waking only briefly for meals and medication. During his conscious moments, he seemed confused and agitated, struggling to communicate with slurred speech that was difficult to understand. The man who had been sharp-tongued and quick-witted, even in his criticism, seemed lost inside his own mind. I held his hand, noting how frail it had become, and tried to imagine what he would want if he could clearly express his wishes. Dad had always been proud and independent, dismissive of weakness in himself and others. Would he want to fight for recovery, even if it meant months or years of diminished capacity? Or would he prefer the dignity of a peaceful end, surrounded by family but free from the struggle of rehabilitation? The truth was, I didn't know. Despite all the years of caring for him, despite all our conversations about his health and his future, we had never discussed end-of-life preferences in any meaningful detail. He had always deflected such conversations, insisting he had plenty of time to worry about such things later. Now later had arrived, and I was left to guess at his wishes while navigating my own complex feelings about our relationship. Friday morning brought David's return from his business trip, and I felt a surge of relief at having his support during such a difficult time. David had always gotten along well with my father, perhaps because he wasn't burdened by the complicated history that shaped my relationship with Dad. He could see Dad's good qualities without being constantly reminded of childhood disappointments and ongoing tensions. David listened carefully as I described the conversations with Michael and the mounting pressure to make decisions about Dad's care. Unlike Michael, David didn't try to steer me toward any particular conclusion. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about what I believed Dad would want, about my own feelings regarding the various options, and about how we could best support whatever decision we made as a family. His presence provided a sense of stability that I desperately needed. David had a way of cutting through emotional complexity to focus on practical considerations without dismissing the feelings involved. He suggested that we take time to gather more information, to consult with additional specialists if necessary, and to make sure we understood all available options before committing to any particular path. Michael was less pleased with David's involvement in our family discussions. He had always maintained a certain distance from my husband, treating him politely but never warmly. Michael seemed to view David as an outsider whose opinions carried less weight than those of blood relatives. This attitude became more pronounced as David began asking detailed questions about the hospice consultation Michael had arranged. The hospice representative, a soft-spoken woman named Linda Morrison, met with us Saturday afternoon in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU. She was professional and compassionate, explaining their philosophy of comfort-focused care and outlining the services they could provide. Linda emphasized that hospice care didn't necessarily mean giving up, but rather shifting focus from cure to comfort, from aggressive treatment to quality of life. Michael asked detailed questions about pain management, family support services, and the logistics of transitioning from hospital to hospice care. His questions were practical and thorough, covering everything from insurance coverage to the specifics of what medical equipment would be provided. Linda answered each question with the kind of detailed information that clearly demonstrated her experience with families facing similar decisions. But when I asked about timeframes and what the transition to hospice care would mean for ongoing medical evaluation, Linda's answers were more vague. She explained that hospice care was typically recommended when a patient's life expectancy was estimated at 6 months or less, but acknowledged that such predictions were often imprecise. She emphasized families could always reconsider their decision if a patient's condition improved significantly. David asked about alternative rehabilitation options, wondering if there were specialized facilities that might offer more aggressive therapy for stroke recovery. Linda acknowledged that such options existed, but suggested that given Dad's age and the severity of his stroke, the likelihood of meaningful improvement was limited. She gently encouraged us to consider what would provide the most comfort and dignity for Dad during what might be his final months. After Linda left, Michael seemed energized by the conversation, ready to move forward with hospice arrangements. He had already researched facilities and had strong preferences about where Dad should be placed. His efficiency was impressive, but it also felt rushed, like he was eager to resolve a complicated situation as quickly as possible. I asked for more time to consider our options, suggesting that we consult with additional specialists before making such a significant decision. Michael's impatience was obvious, though he tried to mask it with expressions of concern about prolonging Dad's suffering. He pointed out that every day we delayed was another day of aggressive medical intervention that might not be in Dad's best interest. The conversation became heated when David supported my request for additional consultations. Michael accused us of being in denial about Dad's condition, of pursuing false hope that would only make his final weeks more difficult. He suggested that my emotional attachment to Dad was preventing me from seeing the situation clearly, and that David's lack of medical background made his opinions irrelevant. It was then that Michael revealed he had been in contact with Dad's attorney about updating his estate planning documents. He explained that Dad's current will and power of attorney designations needed to be revised to reflect his changed circumstances. Michael had scheduled a meeting with the attorney for Monday morning, with plans to bring the necessary documents to the hospital for Dad's signature. This revelation caught me completely off guard. While I knew that Dad's legal documents might need updating, I hadn't realized that Michael had taken it upon himself to initiate this process. When I asked about the specific changes being proposed, Michael was evasive, saying only that they needed to ensure Dad's wishes were properly documented, and that his estate planning reflected current realities. David asked direct questions about what changes were being made, and why they couldn't wait until Dad's condition stabilized or improved. Michael's responses were technical and legalistic, filled with terminology about incapacity planning and healthcare directives. He assured us that everything was being done in Dad's best interest, but he seemed reluctant to provide specific details about what documents Dad would be asked to sign. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Michael's eagerness to have Dad sign legal documents felt wrong, especially given his simultaneous push toward hospice care. I kept thinking about the timing, about how quickly Michael had moved from discussing medical care to arranging legal consultations. The coincidence felt too convenient, too planned. I spent the early hours of Sunday morning researching estate planning and power of attorney documents, trying to understand what changes might be necessary, and why they couldn't wait for Dad's cognitive function to improve. What I learned made me more uncomfortable about Michael's rush to have documents signed, while Dad was still recovering from his stroke. Legal capacity requires more than just consciousness. It requires the ability to understand the nature and consequences of the decisions being made. Given Dad's current cognitive state, his slurred speech, and his obvious confusion about his surroundings, it seemed questionable whether he had the mental capacity to make significant legal decisions. When I called Michael Sunday morning to discuss my concerns, he was dismissive of my research, reminding me that he was the attorney in the family and understood these matters better than I did. He assured me that the attorney handling Dad's affairs was experienced with incapacity planning and would properly assess Dad's mental state before proceeding with any document signing. But Michael's reassurances didn't address my fundamental concern about the timing and the pressure to make these changes so quickly. When I suggested that we wait until Dad's condition improved, or at least stabilized, Michael became irritated, accusing me of unnecessarily complicating a straightforward legal matter. Sunday afternoon, I visited Dad alone, hoping for some clarity about his mental state and his ability to communicate his wishes. He was more alert than he had been in several days, though his speech remained severely impaired. I tried to explain the situation carefully, asking if he understood that Michael wanted him to sign some legal documents the following day. Dad's response was difficult to interpret. He seemed agitated by the mention of legal documents, but whether this was due to confusion, concern, or simply frustration with his inability to communicate clearly, was impossible to determine. When I asked if he wanted Michael to handle his legal affairs, his response was ambiguous at best. What was clear was that Dad was struggling to process complex information, and that his cognitive function, while improved from the first day after his stroke, remained significantly impaired. The idea of him making important legal decisions in his current state seemed premature at best, and potentially harmful at worst. That evening, David and I discussed our options. We could try to delay the legal consultation, but Michael had already made the arrangements and seemed determined to proceed. We could insist on being present for any document signing, but Michael had suggested this wasn't necessary, since he was handling the legal aspects of Dad's care. David suggested that we contact Dad's attorney directly to express our concerns about Dad's mental capacity and the timing of any legal changes. This seemed like a reasonable approach, but I worried about creating family conflict that might ultimately harm Dad's care and recovery. As I prepared for bed Sunday night, I felt a growing sense of unease about the next day's planned legal consultation. Something about Michael's behavior, his rush to make changes, and his reluctance to provide details about what Dad would be signing felt wrong. But I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was troubling me, or whether my concerns were justified.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably cool weather for Phoenix, and I found myself arriving at the hospital earlier than usual. The ICU was quieter than normal, with fewer visitors and a sense of calm that felt temporary and fragile. Dad was awake when I arrived, and while his speech remained impaired, he seemed more alert than he had been in days. I had decided to be present when Michael and the attorney arrived, regardless of whether my presence was welcome. This was too important a decision to leave entirely in Michael's hands, especially given my growing concerns about Dad's cognitive state and his ability to understand the implications of whatever documents he might be asked to sign. The attorney James Wellington arrived at 10 o'clock with Michael close behind. Wellington was an older man, probably in his 60s, with the kind of formal demeanor that suggested years of handling sensitive family matters. He carried a leather briefcase and had the careful, measured way of speaking that comes from dealing with legal documents and family conflicts. Michael introduced me to Wellington, explaining that I was Dad's primary caregiver, but that he was handling the legal aspects of Dad's affairs. Wellington nodded politely, but seemed to direct most of his attention to Michael, treating him as the primary point of contact for the family. When I asked about the specific documents Dad would be signing, Wellington and Michael exchanged a look that made me uncomfortable.
Wellington explained that they were updating Dad's healthcare directives and making some adjustments to his power of attorney designations to better reflect his current circumstances. I pressed for more specific information about what changes were being made and why they were necessary at this particular time. Wellington's response was professional but evasive, filled with legal terminology about incapacity planning and the importance of having proper documentation in place during medical crises. Michael added that these were routine updates that should have been made years ago, and that Dad's stroke had simply highlighted the need to ensure his legal affairs were properly organized. He seemed impatient with my questions, suggesting that we were wasting time with unnecessary details when the important thing was getting the proper documentation in place. As Wellington began explaining the documents to Dad, I watched my father's face carefully, trying to assess his understanding of what was being discussed. Dad nodded occasionally and made some verbal responses, but his speech was still slurred and his answers seemed confused. When Wellington asked if Dad understood that he was updating his healthcare directives, Dad's response was barely audible and didn't clearly indicate comprehension. It was then that I noticed Janet Rodriguez, one of the ICU nurses who had been caring for Dad since his admission. She was standing near the doorway, apparently checking on Dad's condition, but I could see she was listening to the conversation. Janet had been particularly attentive to Dad's care, and I had appreciated her kindness and professionalism during such a difficult time. Janet caught my eye and gave me a look that seemed significant, though I couldn't interpret exactly what she was trying to communicate. She lingered near the doorway longer than necessary for a routine check, and I had the distinct feeling that she wanted to say something but was constrained by the presence of Wellington and Michael. Wellington continued explaining the documents, outlining Dad's rights and the implications of the changes being made. But his explanations seemed rushed, more focused on getting through the legal requirements than ensuring Dad's true understanding. When he asked Dad if he had any questions, Dad's response was mumbled and unclear. Michael seemed eager to proceed with the signing, assuring Wellington that Dad understood the documents and was ready to execute them. But I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Dad's apparent confusion and his inability to clearly communicate his understanding of what was happening. It was then that Janet stepped closer to the bed, ostensibly to check Dad's IV, but positioning herself where she could speak quietly to me. What she whispered changed everything. "Don't let him sign. Something's not right about this." Her words sent a chill through me, confirming the unease I had been feeling all morning. Janet had been caring for stroke patients for years, and her assessment of Dad's cognitive state carried more weight than Wellington's legal procedures or Michael's assurances. If she was concerned enough to risk speaking up during a legal consultation, then my instincts about Dad's incapacity were probably correct. But confronting Michael and Wellington in that moment would create a family crisis that could have lasting implications. I needed to think quickly about how to handle Janet's warning without destroying relationships or creating a situation that might ultimately harm Dad's care. The next few minutes would determine not just what legal documents Dad signed, but the entire trajectory of his care and the future of our family relationships. Janet's whispered warning had given me the courage to act on my concerns, but I still had to figure out how to protect Dad without creating irreparable damage to the family dynamics that would shape his remaining years. I felt my heart racing as Janet's words echoed in my mind. Her warning had been quiet but urgent, and the way she glanced toward Michael and the attorney before stepping back suggested she knew she was taking a risk by speaking up. I had to make a decision quickly, but I also needed to understand exactly what Janet had observed that made her so concerned. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and addressed Wellington directly. "I'm sorry, but I need to ask for a brief delay. I'm concerned about my father's cognitive state and whether he's truly capable of understanding these documents right now." My voice was steadier than I felt, but I could see Michael's jaw tighten at my interruption. Wellington looked surprised by my intervention, glancing between Michael and me as if trying to determine who had the authority to make such decisions. Michael immediately stepped in, his tone sharp with barely controlled irritation. "Sarah, we've already discussed this. Dad is alert and responsive. The attorney has assessed his capacity, and we need to get these documents executed while he's having a good day." But I wasn't backing down, not with Janet's warning fresh in my mind and my own growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. With all due respect, Mr. Wellington, my father suffered a massive stroke less than a week ago. His speech is severely impaired, he's confused about basic information, and he's been heavily medicated. I don't believe he has the cognitive capacity to make major legal decisions right now. Wellington set down his pen and looked at me with the kind of measured patience that suggested he had dealt with family disagreements before. Miss Mitchell, I understand your concerns, but I've been practicing elder law for over 30 years. I'm quite capable of assessing whether a client has the mental capacity to execute legal documents. Your father has responded appropriately to my questions and seems to understand the nature of what we're discussing. I looked at Dad, who was watching this exchange with obvious confusion. His eyes moved from person to person, and I could see he was struggling to follow the conversation. When Wellington had asked him questions earlier, his responses had been mumbled and unclear. The idea that this constituted informed consent seemed absurd to me. What specific questions did you ask him? I pressed, because from where I'm standing, his responses were barely coherent. How can you be certain he understands the implications of whatever changes you're making to his legal documents? Michael's face was flushed with anger now, and I could see he was struggling to maintain his composure in front of Wellington. Sarah, you're being completely unreasonable. Dad has been alert and communicative with the medical staff. Dr. Hernandez herself said his cognitive function is improving daily. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. That's when Janet stepped forward again, and I realized she had been waiting for an opening to speak. Excuse me, she said quietly, addressing Wellington directly. I've been Mr. Mitchell's primary nurse since his admission, and I need to express some concerns about his current cognitive state. Wellington looked annoyed by yet another interruption, but Janet continued with professional confidence. Mitchell has been experiencing significant confusion and disorientation since his stroke. This morning he was unable to tell me what year it is, he didn't recognize his room, and he's been asking repeatedly for his deceased wife. While he can respond to simple questions, his comprehension of complex information appears severely compromised. Michael's face darkened at Janet's assessment. That's not consistent with what we've observed. Dad has been coherent when we've spoken with him. You may be seeing him at his worst moments, but we're his family. We know his baseline better than anyone. Janet's response was measured but firm. I've been caring for stroke patients for 15 years, Mr. Mitchell. I've seen patients who can appear lucid during brief interactions, but who lack the sustained cognitive function necessary for complex decision-making. Your father's responses this morning suggest to me that while he's conscious and can communicate at a basic level, his capacity for understanding complex legal concepts is questionable at best. Wellington was clearly uncomfortable with Janet's intervention. Legal consultations weren't typically interrupted by nursing staff, and I could see he was uncertain about how to proceed. He had been hired by Michael to handle Dad's affairs, but Janet's professional assessment carried significant weight, especially if there were later questions about Dad's capacity at the time of signing. I seized on Janet's support to press my case further. Mr. Wellington, given what Nurse Rodriguez has observed, and given that this is barely a week after my father's stroke, wouldn't it be more prudent to wait until his cognitive function has stabilized before having him execute major legal documents? Wellington consulted his notes and then looked at Dad again, clearly reassessing the situation. Dad was staring at the ceiling now, seemingly unaware of the intense discussion taking place around his bed. When Wellington called his name, Dad looked at him, but his expression was blank, confused. Mr. Mitchell, Wellington said slowly and clearly, can you tell me what year it is? Dad's response was slurred and barely audible. What I could make out sounded like 1990-something, which was clearly wrong. Wellington asked him to identify the people in the room, and while Dad could point to me and mumble daughter, he seemed uncertain about Michael and couldn't identify Wellington at all. The attorney was clearly reconsidering his assessment of Dad's capacity. He closed the folder of documents and turned to Michael with obvious discomfort. Mr. Mitchell, based on what I'm observing now, I'm not entirely comfortable proceeding with the document execution today. Your father seems more confused than he was when I first arrived. Michael's control finally snapped. This is ridiculous. You people are making this far more complicated than it needs to be. These are routine legal updates that should have been done years ago. Every day we delay is another day Dad suffers unnecessarily, because his affairs aren't properly organized. But Wellington was shaking his head. I understand your frustration, but I have an ethical obligation to ensure that any client signing legal documents has the capacity to understand what they're agreeing to. Based on your father's responses just now, I don't feel comfortable proceeding today. Janet spoke up again, her voice gentle but firm. If I may suggest, there are cognitive assessment tools that can provide a more objective evaluation of Mr. Mitchell's decision-making capacity. Dr. Hernandez could order a formal evaluation if the family feels it's necessary. This suggestion seemed to infuriate Michael even more. A formal evaluation? Are you people out of your minds? Dad doesn't need to jump through hoops to update his own legal documents. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that makes everything more difficult than it needs to be. I looked at Michael carefully, trying to understand his intense reaction to the suggestion of waiting or getting a formal assessment. His anger seemed disproportionate to the situation, and his eagerness to have Dad sign documents while his cognitive function was questionable struck me as increasingly suspicious. Michael, I said as calmly as I could manage, what exactly is in these documents that can't wait a few more days or weeks? What's so urgent that Dad needs to sign them while he's still recovering from his stroke? Michael's hesitation before answering was telling. They're healthcare directives and power of attorney updates, things that need to be in place given Dad's current condition. The longer we wait, the more complicated everything becomes. But I pressed harder. What specific changes are you making? I've been Dad's primary caregiver for 2 years, and I'm not aware of any problems with his current legal documents that would require such urgent updates. Wellington looked uncomfortable with the family tension that was escalating around him.
Perhaps this is a conversation the family should have privately, he suggested. I can reschedule for next week, which would give Mr. Mitchell more time to recover and allow the family to discuss the proposed changes in detail. Michael's response was immediate and sharp. That's not necessary. Sarah doesn't understand the legal complexities involved here. She's not qualified to evaluate what documents Dad needs. That's when I realized what was really bothering me about this entire situation. Michael was treating me like an outsider in decisions about our father's care, despite the fact that I had been the one managing Dad's daily needs for the past 2 years. He was using his legal expertise and Dad's condition to push through changes that he hadn't bothered to discuss with me in any detail. I may not be a lawyer, I said, feeling my own anger rising, but I am Dad's daughter, and I've been making decisions about his care and well-being long before this stroke happened. If there are changes being made to his legal documents, I have a right to understand what they are and why they're necessary. Wellington cleared his throat diplomatically. Actually, depending on the current power of attorney designations, both of you may have decision-making authority regarding your father's affairs. Perhaps I should review the existing documents more carefully before we proceed with any changes. This suggestion seemed to alarm Michael, and for the first time since this conversation began, I saw something that looked like panic flash across his face. The existing documents are outdated and inadequate for Dad's current situation. That's exactly why we need to update them now, while Dad can still participate in the process. But Janet wasn't finished. She had been listening to this exchange carefully, and now she stepped closer to Dad's bed. Mitchell, she said gently, can you tell me who has been taking care of you for the past 2 years? Who brings you to your doctor appointments and visits you at your apartment? Dad looked at her with obvious confusion, then slowly turned his gaze to me. Sarah, he said clearly, the first word he had spoken distinctly since Wellington arrived. Sarah takes care of me. Janet nodded and continued. And who do you trust to make decisions about your medical care if you can't make them yourself? Dad's response was slower this time, but still clear enough to understand. Sarah knows. Sarah decides. The impact of Dad's words was immediate and unmistakable. Despite his cognitive impairment, despite the confusion and disorientation that had marked his responses to Wellington's questions, Dad had clearly identified me as the person he trusted with his care and decision-making. Michael's face went white, and I could see him struggling to process what had just happened. Wellington was taking notes, clearly recognizing the significance of Dad's statements about his preferences for care and decision-making authority. This doesn't change anything, Michael said quickly, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Dad is confused and not thinking clearly. The legal documents need to reflect practical realities, not sentimental preferences. But I was beginning to understand what might be happening here. Michael, are you trying to change Dad's power of attorney designation?
Are you trying to make yourself his primary decision maker? The silence that followed my question was deafening. Michael didn't answer immediately, and his hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Wellington was looking between us with obvious discomfort, clearly realizing he had walked into a family conflict that went far deeper than routine legal updates. Finally, Michael spoke, his tone defensive. The current power of attorney arrangements are impractical given Dad's condition and the decisions that need to be made. Someone with legal training needs to be managing his affairs, especially if his condition deteriorates further. Someone with legal training, I repeated slowly, or someone who lives 3 states away and visits twice a year. Michael, I've been managing Dad's affairs just fine for the past 2 years. What's changed that suddenly makes me unqualified? Michael's answer revealed more than he probably intended. What's changed is that Dad now requires complex medical and financial decisions that have long-term implications. Decisions about care facilities, treatment options, and asset management that require expertise you don't have. I felt a chill as I understood the implications of what Michael was saying. He wasn't just talking about routine legal updates, he was positioning himself to take control of Dad's care and finances at precisely the moment when Dad was most vulnerable and least able to advocate for himself. Janet had been listening to this exchange with obvious concern, and now she spoke up again. I think this family needs time to discuss these issues privately, and Mr. Mitchell needs time to recover more fully before making any major legal decisions. In my professional opinion, he's not currently capable of understanding the full implications of complex legal changes. Wellington nodded in agreement. Nurse Rodriguez is correct. I'm going to recommend that we postpone this consultation until Mr. Mitchell's cognitive function has stabilized. I'll also suggest that the family consult with his physician about his current capacity for decision-making. Michael tried one more time to salvage the situation. This delay could create serious problems if Dad's condition deteriorates further. We need to get these documents in place while he can still participate in the process. But Wellington was already packing up his briefcase. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your concerns, but I have an ethical obligation to ensure that my clients have the capacity to understand the documents they're signing. Based on what I've observed today, I'm not confident that your father meets that standard right now. As Wellington left, promising to reschedule once Dad's condition had stabilized, I found myself alone with Michael in a tension that had been building for days. Michael was furious, not just about the postponement, but about what he clearly saw as my interference in his plans for Dad's care. I hope you're satisfied, he said, his voice tight with anger. You've just made everything more complicated and potentially harmful for Dad. These delays could have serious consequences. But I wasn't backing down. Michael, what I'm satisfied about is that Dad isn't being pressured into signing documents he doesn't understand while he's still recovering from a major stroke. What I want to know is why you're in such a hurry to take control of his affairs. Michael's response was immediate and defensive. I'm not trying to take control of anything. I'm trying to ensure that Dad's legal affairs are properly managed by someone with the expertise to handle complex medical and financial decisions. Someone like you, I said, who lives in Seattle and has visited Dad maybe 6 times in the past 2 years. Someone who doesn't know his doctors, his preferences, or his daily routine. Michael, why are you really pushing for these changes? That's when Michael revealed something that shocked me. Because Dad asked me to, he said quietly. Before his stroke, Dad called me and said he was concerned about the burden his care was placing on you and your family. He wanted to make arrangements to ensure that you wouldn't be overwhelmed if his condition got worse. I stared at Michael, trying to process what he had just told me. Dad had expressed concerns about being a burden, but he had never mentioned wanting to change our caregiving arrangements. If anything, he had seemed grateful for my help, and had often expressed appreciation for my visits and assistance with his daily needs. When was this conversation? I asked. Because Dad never mentioned anything like this to me, and we talk about his care arrangements regularly. Michael's hesitation suggested that this conversation might not have been as straightforward as he was presenting it. It was about a month ago. Dad was having one of his bad days, feeling frustrated about his limitations and worried about the future. He specifically asked me to look into updating his legal documents to make things easier for everyone. But something about Michael's account didn't ring true. Dad had been having more difficult days recently, but our conversations during that time had focused on adjusting his care routine, not on changing our fundamental arrangements. If he had been seriously considering such major changes, it seemed unlikely that he wouldn't have mentioned it to me. Janet, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped closer to Dad's bed and checked his vital signs. Dad had dozed off during our argument, and his peaceful expression contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. "You know," Janet said quietly, "in my experience, patients recovering from strokes often express concerns about being burdens on their families. It's a normal part of processing their changed circumstances, but those concerns don't necessarily represent their true preferences for care, especially when they're expressed during periods of depression or frustration." Michael frowned at Janet's observation. "Are you suggesting that my father wasn't sincere when he expressed his concerns to me?" Janet's response was diplomatic but pointed. "I'm suggesting that patients in your father's situation often say things they don't really mean, especially when they're struggling with their loss of independence. What matters more than temporary expressions of frustration is the consistent pattern of their relationships and preferences." She gestured toward Dad's sleeping form. "Your father has consistently identified your sister as his primary caregiver and decision-maker. Even in his current confused state, he was clear about trusting her with his care. That suggests a deep established preference that goes beyond whatever concerns he might have expressed during a difficult moment." I looked at Michael, trying to understand whether he genuinely believed he was acting in Dad's best interests, or whether he had his own motivations for wanting to take control of Dad's affairs. The timing of his supposed conversation with Dad, just weeks before the stroke, seemed convenient. The urgency he was showing about updating legal documents while Dad was cognitively impaired seemed suspicious. But I also had to consider the possibility that Michael was telling the truth about Dad's concerns. Maybe Dad had been more worried about being a burden than he had let on to me. Maybe he had reached out to Michael because he felt I was already doing too much and he didn't want to add to my stress by discussing his concerns directly. The uncertainty was agonizing. Without Dad being able to clearly communicate his true preferences, I was left to interpret conflicting information and decide what course of action would best serve his interests. Michael claimed to be acting on Dad's expressed wishes, but those wishes conveniently aligned with Michael's own preferences for how Dad's care should be managed. Janet seemed to sense my internal struggle. "You know," she said gently, "there's no rush to make these decisions right now. Your father's immediate medical needs are being addressed, and his legal affairs aren't going to fall apart if you take time to sort through these questions carefully." She was right, of course. The pressure I was feeling to resolve everything immediately was largely artificial, created by Michael's sense of urgency rather than any real deadline. Dad's care was stable, his finances were secure, and his current legal documents were adequate for managing his immediate needs. "Janet," I said, "what's your honest assessment of Dad's cognitive function right now? How long before he might be able to participate meaningfully in decisions about his care and legal affairs?" Janet considered the question carefully. "Stroke recovery is unpredictable, but I've seen significant improvement in your father's alertness and communication over the past few days. Dr. Hernandez is cautiously optimistic about continued progress, though she's warned that the process could take weeks or months." She paused, glancing at Michael before continuing. "What I can tell you is that rushing major decisions while he's still in the acute recovery phase is rarely in a patient's best interest. The cognitive assessment I mentioned earlier could provide objective guidance about his current capacity and help you make informed decisions about timing." Michael was clearly frustrated by Janet's recommendations for delay and formal assessment. "This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic obstacles that make everything more difficult," he said. "Dad doesn't need to prove his competency to manage his own affairs." But Janet's response was firm. "Actually, when there are questions about capacity, especially following a major neurological event like a stroke, formal assessment is standard practice. It protects both the patient and the family from decisions that might later be questioned or regretted." I found myself grateful for Janet's expertise and advocacy. Her professional perspective provided an objective counterbalance to Michael's pressure and my own emotional confusion about what Dad would really want. "I think we should request the cognitive assessment," I said finally. "And I think we should wait until Dad's condition has stabilized before making any major changes to his legal documents." Michael's reaction was immediate and angry. "Sarah, you're making a serious mistake. these delays could have consequences that none of us can predict. If Dad's condition deteriorates while we're waiting for bureaucratic procedures, we could lose the opportunity to ensure his affairs are properly arranged. But I was becoming more confident in my decision. Michael, if Dad's cognitive function improves, then he can participate meaningfully in decisions about his own care. If it doesn't improve significantly, then we'll have objective evidence that he lacks the capacity to make such decisions and will need to proceed accordingly. Michael stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could continue to pressure me to support immediate legal changes, but Janet's professional assessment and Wellington's obvious discomfort with Dad's cognitive state had undermined his position significantly. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "Fine, we'll wait for your assessment and your timeline. But when this delay creates problems, I want you to remember that I tried to prevent them." With that, Michael gathered his things and left the room, leaving me alone with Dad and Janet. The tension in the room seemed to lift immediately with his departure, and I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time since the legal consultation had begun. Janet checked Dad's monitors one more time and then turned to me with a gentle smile. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Trust your instincts about your father's care. You know him better than anyone else." As I sat beside Dad's bed, watching him sleep peacefully, I reflected on everything that had happened. Janet's warning had given me the courage to stand up to Michael's pressure, but the deeper questions about Dad's care and his true wishes remained unresolved. What I knew for certain was that Dad deserved time to recover as much as possible before being asked to make major decisions about his future. He deserved to have his cognitive capacity properly assessed rather than being rushed into signing documents he might not understand. And he deserved to have his consistent, long-standing trust in my caregiving respected rather than being overridden by Michael's sudden involvement. The next few days would be crucial in determining Dad's trajectory and our family's path forward. But thanks to Janet's warning and intervention, we would face those decisions with proper medical guidance rather than legal pressure, with time for consideration rather than rushed judgment, and with Dad's demonstrated preferences given the weight they deserved. I squeezed Dad's hand gently and settled in for another long day of waiting, watching, and hoping for his continued recovery. The cognitive assessment Dr. Hernandez ordered took place 3 days later. A neuropsychologist named Dr. Rebecca Chen spent nearly 2 hours with Dad, conducting a comprehensive evaluation that tested everything from basic orientation to complex reasoning abilities. I sat in the waiting area during the assessment, nervously checking my phone and trying to prepare myself for whatever the results might reveal. Michael had flown back to Seattle the day after the failed legal consultation, claiming urgent work commitments but clearly frustrated with the delay. Before leaving, he had made several pointed comments about my emotional decision-making and the potential consequences of postponing Dad's legal arrangements. His departure actually came as a relief, removing the constant pressure and tension that had marked every conversation about Dad's care. David had taken time off work to be with me during the assessment, understanding how much was riding on Dr. Chen's evaluation. Our sons were staying with friends again, giving us the freedom to focus entirely on Dad's situation without worrying about their school schedules or emotional needs during this uncertain time. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from Dad's room, her expression was thoughtfully neutral, giving no indication of what she had discovered. She invited David and me into a small conference room where she could discuss her findings in detail. "Your father is a fascinating case, Dr. Chen began, settling into her chair with a thick folder of test results. Stroke recovery is always unpredictable, but his pattern of cognitive functioning is particularly interesting." She opened the folder and pulled out several charts showing Dad's performance on various tests. "In terms of basic orientation and simple memory tasks, your father shows significant improvement from what I would expect immediately post-stroke. He knows where he is, he recognizes family members consistently, and he can follow simple instructions." I felt a surge of hope at her words, but Dr. Chen continued with obvious caution. "However, when we move into more complex cognitive tasks, the picture becomes more complicated. His ability to process complex information, understand abstract concepts, and anticipate consequences of decisions remains substantially impaired." David leaned forward, asking the question I was afraid to voice. What does that mean in practical terms? Can he make informed decisions about his care and legal affairs? Dr. Chen considered her response carefully. Your father can certainly participate in discussions about his care and express preferences about day-to-day matters. But complex legal decisions, financial planning, and long-term care arrangements involve levels of abstract thinking and consequence anticipation that he currently struggles with. She pulled out a specific test result that showed Dad's performance on decision-making scenarios. For example, when I presented him with hypothetical situations requiring him to weigh multiple factors and consider long-term implications, his responses were often inconsistent or showed poor understanding of cause and effect relationships. The implications of Dr. Chen's assessment were becoming clear, but I needed her to be explicit about what this meant for the legal document situation. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, does my father currently have the cognitive capacity to execute major changes to his legal documents? Her response was unambiguous. Based on today's assessment, I would not recommend that your father sign complex legal documents at this time. While he shows promising signs of recovery, his current cognitive function does not meet the standard for informed consent regarding major legal or financial decisions. David and I exchanged glances, both feeling vindicated in our decision to resist Michael's pressure for immediate document signing. Janet's warning had prevented Dad from making potentially harmful decisions while his cognitive function was compromised. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished with her assessment. I do want to emphasize that this represents his current cognitive state, not necessarily his long-term prognosis. I've seen stroke patients continue to improve for months or even years after their initial event. Your father's relatively young age and his motivation during testing suggest he has good potential for continued recovery. This news filled me with hope, but also highlighted the importance of giving Dad time to recover as much as possible before making irreversible decisions about his care and legal affairs. The rush that Michael had been pushing for could have permanently altered Dad's situation based on his cognitive state at his lowest point. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked. When might he be ready to participate meaningfully in complex decisions? Dr. Chen shook her head. Every patient is different, but I would recommend reassessment in about 6 weeks. That would give us a better sense of his trajectory and his ultimate cognitive recovery potential. As we left the hospital that day, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that we had made the right decision in delaying the legal consultation, and anticipation about Dad's continued recovery and what that might mean for his future care needs. That evening, I called Michael to update him on Dr. Chen's findings. His response was predictably negative, focusing on the delay rather than the protection of Dad's interests that the assessment had provided. So we're looking at weeks or months of uncertainty while Dad's affairs remain in limbo, Michael said, his frustration evident even over the phone. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. I tried to explain Dr. Chen's optimism about Dad's recovery potential, but Michael seemed more focused on the immediate inconvenience than the long-term benefits of waiting for improved cognitive function. Michael, I said finally, Dr. Chen confirmed that Dad doesn't currently have the capacity to make complex legal decisions. If we had proceeded with the document signing, those decisions could have been challenged later or worse, they could have been made against Dad's true interests. Michael's response revealed more about his thinking than he probably intended. Dad's true interests are being served by having someone with legal expertise managing his affairs. Whether he fully understands every detail is less important than ensuring his care and finances are properly handled. I felt a chill at Michael's casual dismissal of Dad's need to understand and consent to changes in his legal arrangements. This wasn't about efficient management of Dad's affairs, this was about fundamental questions of autonomy and decision-making authority. Michael, Dad deserves to understand and agree to changes that affect his life, especially major ones. If he can't do that right now, then we wait until he can, or we proceed only with changes that are absolutely necessary for his immediate well-being. Our conversation ended with the same tension that had marked all our discussions about Dad's care, but now I felt more confident in my position. Dr. Chen's assessment had provided objective support for the concerns Janet and I had raised about Dad's cognitive capacity. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine of visiting Dad daily and working with his medical team to optimize his recovery. Janet continued to be an invaluable source of information and advocacy, updating me on Dad's progress and helping me understand the rehabilitation process. Dad's improvement was gradual but noticeable. His speech became clearer, his confusion less frequent, and his ability to follow complex conversations improved steadily. Dr. Hernandez was cautiously optimistic about his progress, though she continued to emphasize that full recovery was uncertain. It was during the third week after the cognitive assessment that Dad brought up the subject of his legal documents himself. We were sitting together in his room during one of his more alert periods, and he suddenly asked me about Michael's visit and the attorney who had come to see him. "Sarah," he said, his speech much clearer than it had been weeks earlier, "there was something about papers I was supposed to sign. I remember being confused about what they were for." I explained carefully about Michael's plan to update his legal documents and the concerns that had been raised about his cognitive capacity at the time. Dad listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about what changes Michael had proposed and why the document signing had been postponed. When I finished explaining the situation, Dad was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the information. Finally, he looked at me with an expression that was more focused and determined than I had seen since his stroke. "I'm glad you stopped it," he said firmly. "I wasn't thinking clearly then, and I don't remember agreeing to any changes. Michael means well, but he doesn't understand my situation the way you do." Dad's clear statement about his preferences felt like a breakthrough, both in terms of his cognitive recovery and in resolving the family conflict about his care. But I wanted to make sure he understood all the implications before making any definitive decisions. Michael was concerned about making sure someone with legal training could manage your affairs if your condition got worse. He felt that the responsibilities were too much for me to handle alone. Dad's response was immediate and decisive. "Sarah, you've been taking care of me for 2 years. You know my doctors, my medicines, my preferences. Michael is a good lawyer, but he doesn't know anything about my daily life or what I actually need." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "If I need more help with legal or financial matters, you can hire professionals to assist you. But I want you making the decisions, not Michael calling the shots from Seattle." This conversation represented a turning point, not just in Dad's recovery, but in my confidence about advocating for his preferences. His cognitive function had improved enough that his statements about his care preferences carried real weight, and his explicit trust in my caregiving validated the approach I had been taking. But I also knew that Michael wouldn't accept Dad's preferences easily, especially if they conflicted with his own plans for managing Dad's affairs. The conversation I had been dreading would need to happen soon, and it would likely determine the future dynamics of our family relationships. That conversation came sooner than expected. Michael called the following week to discuss his plans for returning to Phoenix to address Dad's legal arrangements. He had spoken with Wellington about rescheduling the consultation and wanted to coordinate a time when all parties could be present. "How is Dad's cognitive function?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping for a specific answer. "Is Dr. Chen ready to clear him for legal decision-making?" I took a deep breath before responding. "Dad's improvement has been remarkable, Michael. His speech is much clearer, his confusion has decreased significantly, and he's been able to participate in complex conversations about his care." Michael seemed pleased by this news. "That's great. So we can move forward with updating his legal documents. I'll coordinate with Wellington to reschedule for next week." But I wasn't finished. "Michael, there's something else we need to discuss. Dad and I have talked about the proposed changes to his legal documents, and he's expressed clear preferences about how he wants his affairs managed." The silence on the other end of the phone told me that Michael suspected where this conversation was heading. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What kind of preferences?" "Dad wants me to continue as his primary decision-maker and caregiver. He understands that you were concerned about the complexity of managing his affairs, but he's comfortable with our current arrangements. If we need additional legal or financial expertise, we can hire professionals to assist us." Michael's response was immediate and sharp. "Sarah, Dad is still recovering from a major stroke. His judgment may be compromised even if his speech has improved. This is exactly why someone with legal training needs to be involved in these decisions. But I was prepared for this argument. Michael, Dr. Chen is planning to reassess Dad's cognitive capacity next week. If she determines that he has the ability to make informed decisions about his care and legal affairs, then his preferences about who manages those affairs should be respected. The conversation that followed was tense and difficult, with Michael arguing that Dad's apparent preferences might be influenced by his emotional dependence on me rather than objective assessment of what arrangement would best serve his interests. He suggested that Dad might be telling me what he thought I wanted to hear rather than expressing his true preferences. These arguments forced me to confront my own motivations and concerns. Was I fighting for Dad's right to choose his care arrangements, or was I fighting to maintain my own role in his life? Was I truly acting in his best interests, or was I influenced by my own emotional needs and family dynamics? But when I thought about Janet's warning and the pressure Michael had applied to have Dad sign documents while his cognitive function was severely compromised, I felt confident that my primary motivation was protecting Dad's rights and well-being. Michael's urgency and his reluctance to wait for Dad's recovery had raised legitimate questions about his priorities. The conversation ended with plans for Michael to return the following week for Dad's cognitive reassessment and potentially a rescheduled legal consultation. The outcome of Dr. Chen's evaluation would determine not just Dad's legal capacity but the entire future of our family's approach to his care. As I prepared for Michael's return and the crucial decisions that lay ahead, I reflected on everything that had happened since Dad's stroke. Janet's warning had prevented what could have been a serious mistake, but it had also forced our family to confront fundamental questions about autonomy, decision-making, and the complex dynamics that shape how families navigate medical crises. Whatever happened in the coming week, I knew that Dad's voice and preferences would be central to any decisions about his future. The cognitive improvement Dr. Chen had documented gave him the opportunity to participate meaningfully in choices about his own care, and both Michael and I would need to respect whatever conclusions he reached about how he wanted his affairs managed. The stakes were high, but for the first time since Dad's stroke, I felt confident that we were approaching these crucial decisions with proper medical guidance, adequate time for consideration, and respect for Dad's own wishes and autonomy. Janet's warning had set in motion a chain of events that had protected Dad's interests and given him the opportunity to recover enough cognitive function to participate in decisions about his own future. As I sat with Dad that evening, watching him work on the crossword puzzle that had become part of his daily routine, I felt grateful for the nurse whose professional instincts and courage had prevented a potentially harmful rush to judgment. Sometimes the most important interventions come from unexpected sources, and sometimes protecting someone you love means being willing to stand up to family pressure and trust your own instincts about what's right. Dr. Chen's second evaluation confirmed what I had hoped, but hardly dared to believe. Dad's cognitive function had improved dramatically over the 6 weeks since his initial assessment. She spent another comprehensive session with him, testing not just his basic orientation but his ability to understand complex scenarios, weigh multiple factors, and anticipate consequences of his decisions. When she met with us afterward, her smile told the story before she spoke a word. "Your father has made remarkable progress," she announced, pulling out charts that showed significant improvement across all cognitive domains. His capacity for complex decision-making has returned to what I would consider normal ranges for someone his age. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Dad could now participate fully in decisions about his own life, his own care, and his own legal arrangements. More importantly, any choices he made would be truly informed and autonomous rather than influenced by cognitive impairment. Michael arrived that afternoon, clearly expecting to finally move forward with his plans for Dad's legal documents. He seemed surprised by the warmth of Dad's greeting and the clarity of his conversation. Over the past 6 weeks, Dad had not only recovered cognitively but had gained strength physically as well. He was sitting up in a chair, speaking clearly, and engaging in detailed discussions about current events and family matters. "You look wonderful, Dad," Michael said, and I could hear genuine surprise in his voice. "The improvement is remarkable." Dad smiled at his son but got straight to the point that had been weighing on his mind. Michael, I understand you've been concerned about my legal arrangements and who should be managing my affairs if I can't do it myself. Michael nodded eagerly, clearly hoping this conversation would lead to the document changes he had been pushing for. That's right, Dad. I've been trying to ensure that you have proper legal protections in place, and that someone with the right expertise is positioned to help manage complex decisions. But Dad's response wasn't what Michael expected. I appreciate your concern, and I understand that you have legal expertise that could be valuable. But I've made my decision about how I want my affairs handled, and I want to make sure you understand my reasoning. Dad explained carefully that while he valued Michael's professional skills, the day-to-day reality of managing his care required someone who understood his medical situation, his personal preferences, and his local support systems. Sarah had been handling these responsibilities effectively for 2 years, and he saw no reason to change an arrangement that was working well. But Dad, Michael interjected, what about complex financial decisions or legal matters that require specialized knowledge? Sarah doesn't have training in those areas. Dad's answer was both practical and decisive. When I need specialized legal or financial advice, I can hire professionals to provide it. But the person making decisions on my behalf needs to be someone who knows me, who understands what I value, and who I trust to put my interests first. That person is Sarah. I watched Michael struggle with Dad's clear statement of his preferences. For weeks, Michael had been arguing that Dad's cognitive impairment made him unable to make sound judgments about his care arrangements. Now faced with Dr. Chen's assessment that Dad's decision-making capacity had returned to normal, Michael had to confront the reality that Dad simply disagreed with his approach. Dad, I think you might be underestimating the complexity of the decisions that could come up. Michael tried one more time. Medical care, insurance issues, potential care facility decisions, financial planning for long-term care. These aren't simple matters, but Dad had clearly thought through these possibilities. Michael, I've been dealing with complex medical and financial decisions my entire adult life. Yes, I may need help understanding certain technical aspects, but the fundamental choices about my care, my living arrangements, and my priorities should be made by someone who knows what matters to me. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael gradually accepting that Dad's preferences were genuine and well considered rather than the product of confusion or emotional dependency. Dr. Chen's assessment had removed the last argument Michael had for overriding Dad's stated wishes. Wellington returned the following day, bringing revised documents that reflected Dad's clearly expressed preferences rather than Michael's proposed changes. The attorney was visibly relieved to be working with a client who could participate fully in understanding and approving the legal arrangements being made. The documents Dad signed that day reinforced the existing arrangements that had been working effectively, with some updates to reflect lessons learned during his medical crisis. I remained his primary decision-maker for both healthcare and financial matters, but with clear provisions for consulting with medical and legal experts when specialized knowledge was needed. Michael accepted Dad's decision with grace, though I could see his disappointment. We had what felt like the first honest conversation we'd had in years, where he acknowledged that his eagerness to take control had been motivated partly by his own discomfort with feeling helpless during Dad's crisis. I've never been good at the day-to-day caregiving stuff, Michael admitted. When Dad got sick, I wanted to help in the way I know how, which is handling legal and financial complexities. But I can see that what Dad really needs is someone who understands his daily life and his personal preferences. This acknowledgement felt like a breakthrough in our relationship. Michael's professional skills were valuable, and there would undoubtedly be times when his legal expertise would be helpful. But the primary responsibility for Dad's care belonged with someone who knew him intimately and could advocate for his personal preferences rather than just managing his affairs efficiently. Dad was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later, moving to a rehabilitation facility where he could continue his physical therapy while regaining strength and independence. The improvement in his condition continued to amaze everyone involved in his care, including Dr. Hernandez, who had been cautiously optimistic but hadn't expected such dramatic recovery. Janet stopped by Dad's room on his last day in the ICU, and I made sure to thank her properly for the warning that had changed everything. Without her professional judgment and her courage to speak up, Dad might have signed documents while cognitively impaired that could have altered the entire trajectory of his care. You did the right thing by listening, Janet said simply. Sometimes families get caught up in their own dynamics and lose sight of what's really best for the patient. Your father needed someone to protect his interests while he couldn't protect them himself. Her words stayed with me as I reflected on everything that had happened. Dad's stroke had created a crisis that revealed important truths about our family dynamics, about the importance of cognitive capacity in legal decision-making, and about the value of professional advocacy from healthcare workers who see these situations regularly. 6 months later, Dad was living independently in a senior community near our home, driving again, and managing most of his own daily activities. His recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations, including his own. The legal arrangements we had preserved during his vulnerable period continued to work well, providing him with the support he needed while respecting his autonomy and preferences. Michael visited more regularly now, having gained a better understanding of Dad's actual needs and a greater appreciation for the ongoing nature of caregiving. Our relationship had improved significantly once we stopped competing for control over Dad's affairs and started working together to support his well-being. But the most important outcome was Dad's restoration to full participation in decisions about his own life. The cognitive assessment that had seemed like a bureaucratic delay to Michael had actually been crucial in protecting Dad's right to make informed choices about his care arrangements. Waiting for his recovery had given him back his voice in determining his own future. Janet's whispered warning had prevented a cascade of decisions that could have fundamentally altered Dad's care, based on his cognitive state at his most vulnerable moment. Instead of being rushed into legal changes he couldn't understand, Dad had been given time to recover and participate meaningfully in choices that would shape his remaining years. The experience taught me invaluable lessons about advocacy, about the importance of professional nursing judgment, and about the courage required to stand up to family pressure when someone vulnerable needs protection. Sometimes the most important intervention comes from an unexpected source, and sometimes protecting someone you love means being willing to say no to arrangements that seem efficient but aren't in their best interest. Dad often spoke about how grateful he was that we had waited for his mind to clear before making major decisions about his future. He had no memory of the confused state he'd been in during those early weeks after his stroke, but he understood how different his situation might have been if we had proceeded with Michael's original plans. Looking back, I realized that Janet's warning had been about more than just Dad's cognitive capacity at that moment. It had been about preserving his fundamental right to participate in decisions about his own life, about maintaining family relationships based on genuine understanding rather than convenient efficiency, and about ensuring that medical crises don't become opportunities for others to impose their preferences on vulnerable people. The nurse who whispered, "Don't let him sign," had given us the most precious gift possible, time for Dad to recover his voice and his agency in determining his own future. Her professional instincts and willingness to speak up had protected not just Dad's legal rights but his dignity and autonomy during the most vulnerable period of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.